The oldest and strongest human emotion is fear. And the oldest and strongest type of fear is trepidation of the unknown. When we were children, our parents told us that monsters didn't exist. But we were sure that something was lurking under the bed or in the closet. Fear sees, even if our eyes are closed. Welcome to the realm of the arcane. My name is Lon Strickler. Join me as I examine unexplained creatures, strange manifestations, and remarkable realities. Imagine this next hour as a voyage of discovery to strange lands, seeking not for new territory, but for new knowledge of the supernatural. Come on board as we begin this adventure together. Hey folks, good evening and welcome to another episode of Arcane Radio, where we explain the unexplained here on the Paranormal King Radio Network. I'm your host, Lon Strickler, coming to you within a cannon shot of historic Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining me. Now, I just want to mention a few things before we introduce the guest. We've rescheduled the Ask Lon Anything chat on Beyond Explanation YouTube channel. That's been rescheduled for this coming Sunday, 27th of September at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And I will be giving away some of my signed books to a few folks who ask questions. So just go to the Beyond Explanation channel and find the live chat link, hook on, and we'll go for there. We had a couple issues this past Wednesday with the internet kind of connection being kind of weak. So we went ahead and rescheduled it. So hopefully everything will go off without a hitch. Now this week, we did get an interesting report that was followed up by Tobias Whalen of the Singular Fortune Society. He's also a member of our Phantom Monsters Fortune research team. This is something that came out of Chicago. But let me read the email, then we'll go from there. The woman stated that according to my mother's friend who lives on 63rd Street and South Pulaski Road in Chicago, Illinois, there has been a rumor of Mothman being present in our backyards. Now, there have been disappearances of people, and neighbors around the area have noticed big chicken-like footprints behind their yards. Now, in my mother's friend's case, she called law enforcement and detectives came only to take pictures and quickly erase the evidence of the Mothman. Many of that area are scared or are warned not to go out at night when the thing appears. Her friend states that law enforcement seems to be covering the fact that this creature is around our neighborhood and they don't do anything about it. I wanted to tell you because it's a very interesting topic, especially since I've grown up doing research on urban legends, yet never knew it would hit so close to home. Thank you so much. And now, Tobias followed up on this. I got this, I got the complete report from him last week and posted it on the blog. This is interesting because she's claiming that people say that people have been disappearing. And I haven't heard anything about that, but I am going to make a FOIA request and I am going to make some other inquiries about this because I have not heard of anything like that. Now, of course, that area at 63rd Street and South Pulaski Road, which is in southwest Chicago, about a mile. It has had several sightings. There's no doubt about that. We have received at least two very strong reports from that intersection or areas just around that intersection. That's the West Lawn neighborhood. So I don't know what's going to come of this. I am going to check into it. Maybe Tobias will have some more information later. But this is the first I've heard of this. Now, we have had some strange footprints show up during this investigation. We had a series of strange footprints in Woodstock, Illinois at one point, and then we had some snow prints show up in another neighborhood in Chicago. So I don't know exactly what's going on, but if we do come up with more information, and of course, if the police are willing to give us the information, this has always been a battle since the beginning with the city. They have been very reluctant to help us at all with this. So if anything comes up, we will follow up with it and get back to you. So tonight, I welcome author, cryptozoologist, and ufologist Nick Redfern to Arcane Radio. Nick is a full-time author and journalist specializing in a wide range of unsolved mysteries, including Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, UFO sightings, government conspiracies, alien abductions, and paranormal phenomena. Nick works on the lecture circuit both in the UK and overseas, and has appeared in internationally syndicated shows discussing UFO phenomena. His most recent title, and the one we will be talking about tonight, is Monsters of the Deep. So, Nick, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, Lon. Well, thanks for having me on the show again.
It's always great to have you on here, and you don't miss publishing a book here and there, so we're always got plenty of stuff to talk about. You've also got a book coming out soon titled The Martians as well.
Yeah, the two of them have kind of collided a little bit. They've been two different companies. One's called Monsters of the Deep, the other one's called The Martians. But as I said, they're both different companies, and very different subjects as well. And but that happens now and again. That they collectively, the companies try and avoid from having, somebody putting out a book at one point and somebody else puts their book out at the same time. They try and avoid that happening, but occasionally it's inevitable. And it kind of looks like I've sort of raced out two books at the same time. But the reality is that the Martians book was finished a long time before the Monsters of the Deep book was finished, but the one company decided, well, we're going to sort of hold back on it, and so it kind of looks like I was sort of racing around like a madman doing two books together, when actually that wasn't the case, and that's sort of one of the weird little things that sort of goes on behind the scenes,
Mm. Well, I look forward to reading it. So, Monsters of the Deep, interesting book. It's got a lot in there. It really does. Covers a lot of different subjects. So, let me ask you right off the bat, what are some of the earliest reports of sea serpents or monsters?
Well, I mean, when you think of sea serpents definitively, we're sort of talking about the 1700s, 1600s upwards, and predominantly people seeing these creatures, usually in sort of the Atlantic and the Pacific, and pretty much, sailors would describe the same thing, like a large snake-like creature. Very often they were described as having like sort of almost like a horse's mane going down the back of its head and down the back of its neck and down the back of its spine. And a lot of these stories are incredible because the witnesses, the ship's captains and the crews, etc., described in many of these earlier stories of these creatures not being sort of like 20, 30 feet long, but we're talking about things sort of 60, 70, 80 feet long, kind of like the sort of thing you'd see in, like in some sort of Japanese monster movie, something along those lines. But you can go back far beyond that in terms of, looking into creatures that may actually have a more a degree of reality, but actually became part of sort of history, but not just history, but also, sort of folklore and mythology. For example, I think a lot of the legends of, for example, things like the Kraken, which is clearly a folkloric creature, but I think it was probably based on early sightings of things like giant squid. So I think sometimes, these monsters were legitimate monsters. Other occasions, they were, and going back, as I said, in folkloric times, I think they were more likely to have been born out of legend and mythology, but they still had a basis in reality.
So then, the colonial and American seafarers, for example, like in the 18th, 19th century, I mean, they actually believed that these monsters existed, and they were very destructive. They definitely had some type of fear of them.
Oh, yeah, and I mean, the important thing is that when you look at a lot of these old stories and, these violent creatures and slamming into ships and, sailors dying and drowning, one of the important things it's important to note is that most of these stories, if not, I would say a good 90-95% of these stories, the captains and the crews actually went on the record. We're not talking about Mr. X type stories or anything like that. We're talking about crews that actually came forward and said, this is what we saw. We saw this 150-foot long creature that slammed into the ship and basically, almost pulled the ship down. And so if you go back and you look at the early reports, we get to see a highly credible body of evidence that suggests strongly that at least up until, say, 150, 200 years ago, there was a long body of sea serpents which, for whatever reason, seem to have, to a great degree, have become possibly completely extinct, or if not completely extinct, their presence is sort of really, waning. And I think that's probably down to the fact that, animals are sort of, very unfortunately, dropping in numbers elsewhere around the planet. And a lot of it comes down to us, the human race. We're very clever, intelligent people, but we're highly destructive as well. And I think that has some degree on, this entire issue of some of these animals that were seen quite regularly, incredibly regularly at times, say 200 or 300 years ago. We're just not really seeing them as much as we did, back then.
Were there any ship disasters that were officially blamed on an encounter with a sea creature?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's particularly in Scandinavia, where you've got Denmark, Sweden, Norway, etc. Particularly in those areas in Scandinavia, there are a lot of stories going back to, particularly to the 1700s and the 1800s, where sailors, captains reported seeing these creatures. And one of the most notable aspects of these stories was that, for the most part, these creatures were extremely violent. And I think that kind of ties in, with, as I mentioned earlier, the tales of the Kraken, which, in mythology was an extremely violent, dangerous creature that would, bring people, or drag people, I should say, and pull ships down into the depths. So again, I think, when you look at these stories that sort of blend mythology and reality, we are actually seeing extremely, violent creatures that, could bring down ships with just like a click of a finger, So certainly Scandinavia and sort of Northern Europe, those are some of the more intriguing areas when it comes to, violence and people being dragged down and drowned, etc.
Really? It's interesting to me because I never really thought about these creatures being seen in like the Baltic or up in the North Sea, but apparently that's the case.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think that's one of the important things, when you're looking into these stories. There's actually a lot that people don't realize, about these stories. It's either, well, this is garbage, or yes, it's this or it's that. People just don't realize, the reality behind so many of these stories. As I said, a lot of people think it's just friend of a friend tales. It's not. I mean, for example, one of the things I talk about in the book is the voluminous files which are held at the British National Archives, which are the equivalent of the US National Archives, where the government keeps all its files, etc. Mm-hmm. Well, at the British National Archives, in the old Admiralty, as it used to be called, today it's called the Royal Navy, when the Admiralty existed a couple of centuries ago, you can go there and read the old documents and the reports and the diaries from the captains of the ships talking about these creatures. And, when you've got highly credible people, captains of ships, etc., talking about these encounters, then you realize that when the government is collecting, actually and literally creating sort of sea serpent files, it's almost like an early X-Files type situation, and so it really does demonstrate, the validity of a lot of these cases.
Yeah, that's interesting because, I've gone back and looked at a lot of the newspaper accounts from back in the 19th century, and occasionally you will come across, a captain or either a sailor will report that something had happened and some type of creature was seen. And I mean, there have been a few that are well known, actually. I mean, I think most of them have been in the Atlantic. But yeah, I was just wondering, officially, and let's say just the U.S., if there's been any official, reports stating that, this is the reason why the ship actually sank or people died and such.
Yeah, as I said, this wasn't sort of like fairy tales and, friend of a friend things. This was a reality. And of course, the vast majority of the planet is water. That's an undeniable fact. Mm-hmm. And I think, that back then, I mean, the planet was very different to what it is now. And the populations, particularly the human populations and pollution and everything else. I think, unfortunately, there has been this sort of decline of these creatures. But, we still do get reports like this now and again, which sort of leads me to believe that, there are at least some of them back, are still around right now. And that possibly, the very fact that some parts of the oceans are so incredibly deep, that most of us, we're not in positions to hire submarines, mini submarines for 3 months, to go diving around. I think that's, again, one of the other reasons why, these creatures aren't seen so much. Their numbers are getting lower and lower, but also they're doing their best to avoid us and pollution as well. You put all that together, you can easily see why, there is this huge variation between what was seen in the 1700s versus what's seen in the 20th century.
Yeah, you talked about the Kraken, which supposedly was a gigantic tentacle behemoth. We do know the existence of giant squids. That has been proven. There's film and such for that. But, how big can these creatures actually get? I guess that's the main question.
Well, I mean, if you look at most of the stories, they talk about sightings of creatures round about sort of 40 to maybe 70 feet in length, and with bodies, kind of like the size of, like a huge beer barrel, that kind of thing. However, there are some cases where the crews were adamant that what they were seeing were in and around sort of the length of anywhere from about 90 to 120 feet long. Now, if they're not exaggerations or mistakes, we'll be talking about really huge, incredibly sized animals. And on top of that, you've got the intriguing aspect that many of the stories are similar. As I said earlier on, most of the crews, it doesn't matter which part of the world it was, down by South America, the Atlantic, the Pacific, most of the people describe seeing these things looking like giant snakes or giant serpents, but with this weird kind of mane, like a horse's mane down its head. Now, of course, back then, there was no internet, no photographs. So I find it intriguing that across different parts of the world, everybody was pretty much talking about these sort of manes running down the head and neck of the animals. And I think that's an important thing to note, the deep similarities. So, when you're talking about some, to get back to your point, I mean, the sheer size of these things, I mean, they're incredibly huge. And as I said, I think things like giant squid were probably responsible for at least some of these stories. We don't get to see giant squid that often. When you do, though, I mean, it really is like coming across a literal monster,
Oh yeah, I mean, you can absolutely understand why, in a bit of fear mixed in, it kind of look a lot bigger than what it actually is, but nonetheless, it's something different. And many of us have read H.P. Lovecraft and his literary and legendary monsters. So, do you think he based some of his creations on these actual events?
Yeah, and I don't think we're talking about excuse me, fabrications or anything like that. But what I do think is that people not having seen these incredibly huge creatures not before, I think it's easy to say, well, it's a sea serpent. Somebody else might say, no, it's the Kraken. We've all heard of this stuff, the Kraken. So I think, it's easy to sort of turn a genuine unknown animal into some sort of folkloric creature, that goes back to sort of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, etc., etc. But the important thing is it still demonstrates that there are weird things out there.
Now, there is an incident that I have written about in the past, but I saw that you also had written about in the book, was the Bloop Phenomenon. Can you describe that for the listeners?
Yeah, sure. Well, this is a really interesting story because this is a relatively recent situation. Back in the 1990s, I should say back in the 1990s, not that long ago. Way back in the 90s. But, in the 1990s, particularly down by between the coastal areas of South America leading down to the South polar areas, in the 1990s, roughly around about 93, 95, 96, the reports using sonar of incredibly huge, what seemed to be incredibly huge creatures under the waters, very low levels, and creatures that really would be a kind of like Godzilla type, sizes. And a number of U.S. government agencies looked into this because at first there were thoughts that what was actually being picked up were sort of break-offs from large icebergs, and they were sort of sinking, and people were mistaking them for large animals. However, the further that the research was undertaken, it actually didn't seem to be the case, that these were not sort of broken off icebergs, that they really were massive animals, and people started making parallels with these creatures with H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu. They were sort of, that's the kind of thing they were talking about. But over time, even the people in the government agencies like NOAA, which is one of the agencies that handles, sort of the pollution and the current state of the oceans, etc., even they were sort of very open to the idea that they really had picked up something using sonar of an incredible size. Now, the important thing is that such was the belief or the suspicion that they were talking about real animals. They actually gave one of them a name, and the name was Bloop. Now, unfortunately, Bloop doesn't sound a particularly monstrous name, but that's what they called it. And if you do a Google now on NOAA, which is NOAA, Bloop, you can actually find the government's own files and its own documents, which again is kind of like a modern day real life X-Files. You had people, in the Navy and, working in the oceans trying to figure out what this creature was. And it was never resolved to this day. You had some people who still believe that, it really was some sort of Cthulhu-esque type creature. Others say, well, maybe it could have been an iceberg, a portion of an iceberg came away. But I said the important thing is that even the NOAA people thought, well, this doesn't seem like something, just a natural thing. It really does seem there was some gigantic thing, sort of roaming around the oceans.
I talked to a friend who was in the Navy about this, about the time I wrote about it. I guess it was like maybe 2008 and such. And I asked him, if he had ever heard of it. He kind of laughed and said, yeah. He said that Navy intelligence actually had done some investigation. They were concerned that there was something huge out there. And the first thing I thought, well, maybe they're picking up a pod of whales or something. And the way he explained to me, it just wasn't like that. This thing was one being of something, and it was huge. So.
Oh, yeah, and you can find them, examples just like that, all over the place. And as I said, though, the big problem is the fact that we're looking for these things in the oceans, and that's not an easy thing to do. It really is a case of being in the right place at the right time. That's kind of exactly the same with like lake monsters, in some of the larger lakes that have these creatures in them. You've got to be really in the right place at the right time, I think.
Now, I know you and I have discussed this in the past, but, do you believe that Nessie or the Loch Ness Monster or other lake monsters originally inhabited the oceans, or do they actually migrate from the oceans into these lakes?
Well, yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that there's something weird in the Loch Ness itself. Now, for people who may not know, Loch Ness, it's called Loch, L-O-C-H, but it's just, Loch is actually just a Scottish word for lake. So all it really means is Lake Ness. Now, reports of the Loch Ness Monster go back roughly round about 1,500 years. And this story comes from St. Columba, who was from Ireland, and he came over to England to try and convert people to Christianity. And in his journals, he talked about how a man was attacked and killed and dragged down by this strange creature in the River Ness. Now, the River Ness actually sort of bleeds into Loch Ness. And so, the earliest story, very credible story, as I said, goes back roughly around about 1,500 years ago. And there have been sporadic reports in the years and centuries afterwards, but the sort of proliferation of the reports started in the early 1930s. And the main reason why that was almost certainly was because up until that point, Loch Ness was really difficult to get around. There weren't actually any really good roads, and it was only till 1933 that this sort of large amount of roads were built so people could go out there and have holidays and vacations and go and sit by the river. That's when people started to see these creatures, because it was so difficult to see them otherwise. And, every year there's probably 5 or 6, 7, 8, very credible reports. And, so in that sense, something is going on. But it's difficult to say for sure what they are. Now, the overriding theory that so many people have, and particularly like the Scottish Tourist Board, is that they want them to be plesiosaurs, which were marine reptiles which existed millions of years ago when the dinosaurs were around. They weren't dinosaurs, but they lived at the same time. Now, the problem with them being plesiosaurs is the fact that, like crocodiles and alligators, plesiosaurs had to surface roughly about every 20 to 25 minutes to get air. So if you've got, let's say, hypothetically, a colony of 15 Nesses, and they're all marine reptiles like alligators and crocodiles, each of one of those 15 Nesses would have to surface about every 45 minutes. So you should be seeing them literally all the time, but we only get to see them very rarely, which gives the sort of the idea that they're not plesiosaurs, and of course the fact that plesiosaurs, about their remains, fossilized remains, have only ever been found in the oceans, which are saltwater, whereas Loch Ness is freshwater.
Right. But
there's another intriguing angle which I'm sort of particularly interested in, is the fact that the Loch Ness itself is a very weird place, and there's a lot of supernatural stuff going on there. For example, Aleister Crowley, the famous occultist and magician, he had a house on the shores of Loch Ness called Boleskine House, and this was this sort of ancient house, and Crowley himself performed all sorts of rituals at Loch Ness to try and summon up demonic entities. And there've been a lot of weird UFO encounters at Loch Ness, and actually we talked to, before we actually started the interview, talking about human sacrifice in the UK centuries ago, and that was something that was rumored to go on in Loch Ness in centuries ago. So one of my sort of pet theories is that the Nesses, so to speak, are possibly far more supernatural in nature than they are in sort of flesh and blood, just giant snakes or giant eels or whatever.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the possible connection of Aleister Crowley, his beliefs in Loch Ness Monster. Do you think that there's any residual energy from Crowley in his rituals that may actually still be affecting what's going on at Loch Ness?
Oh yeah, I do. I mean, I wrote a book actually on the Loch Ness Monster with the stunningly original title of Nessie, and that entire book is about the sort of the supernatural side of all this. But yeah, when you're sort of talking about Crowley himself, I mean, he lived in Boleskine House, this ancient house near the shores of Loch Ness, for a number of years, and he said that he could feel these weird vibes, when he first went into the house to see if he wanted to live there. And when friends and colleagues would visit, they would feel this sort of sense of darkness and fear. And just a couple of times in the last few years, it's been burned down, and nobody really knows who's done that. But when you talk about some sort of residual energy or some sort of atmosphere being left behind, I mean, most people who go there feel, that it is a weird and strange place, which it actually is. In 1974, a well-known Nessie seeker named Ted Holliday had a close encounter with a literal man in black who literally dematerialized in front of him. and different people have described the Nesses as looking different, almost as if they're shapeshifters. Some people have described them as sort of like wriggling worm-type creatures. Other people said they were absolutely sure they saw something like a plesiosaur. One man, a diver who was actually trying to salvage material out of a sunken ship, he swore he saw something that looked like a giant frog. And another man, a military guy in the early part of the 20th century, he swore that what he saw looked just like a camel. So, this has given rise to the idea, are the Nesses kind of shapeshifters, which takes us into another category then.
Oh, yeah. I think you brought this up when we talked about it before, that at one point, out into the north, out in the North Sea and along some of the shorelines, that there were large carcasses found on some of the shorelines.
Yeah, you're right. And it's not so much just found on the shore, but, there are a number of reports, and some people don't realize this, but there probably are around about 30 or 40 reports of people having seen these creatures on the shores of Loch Ness. We're talking about sort of very briefly basking, and some of the people have said that when they saw these creatures and the creatures saw them, they kind of lumbered off in a very awkward way, kind of like, if you look at something like a seal, and it swims through the water, it's sort of really fast and sleek, but you put a seal, on the land, and, it kind of sort of wobbles around like it's drunk, because they're just not sort of really given to that kind of environment. And a lot of people have described that with the Loch Ness Monsters, that they've seen them, moving fast and seeing this fast wake going through the water, but you see them in the marshes and in the dense woods where the waters begin. It's literally like they're stumbling around drunken because they're just not used to being able to operate. So but then again, that sort of raises the question: how can you have something that is part paranormal and part flesh and blood? And I guess that's kind of like some of the things you've looked into, like the flying humanoids. They seem to be flying entities, but then there seems to be like a paranormal aspect to them as well.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the toughest things. When I say toughest, I don't mean from being skeptical, but tough to try and understand, how one of these creatures can be supernatural but physical at the same time,
Yeah, and I believe many of these cryptids that we deal with seem to have a supernatural aspect to them anyway. I mean, they seem to disappear, or they seem to manifest suddenly, or they have qualities where they seem to affect the witnesses that see them. It is. And as far as these water creatures, if they do exist, I would have no doubt that they had some type of supernatural ability as well.
Well, yeah, and for me, I mean, there's a lot of people who view the Nesses as just, as I said earlier, surviving pockets of plesiosaurs, which I don't think is adequate enough. Now, I think if they were flesh and blood animals, and they are flesh and blood animals, I would go down the path of something like giant eels, maybe something like that.
Right.
Because eels are actually fish, and they can leave the water. However, that doesn't, explain the whole thing with Aleister Crowley and, his rituals and his rites and his crazy orgies and all sorts of things. And it doesn't also, explain the numerous reports where people have said they've tried to photograph these creatures only for the cameras to jam, or the pictures don't come out properly. There's so much like that. But the problem is that so many people who are in mainstream cryptozoologist, they just won't touch the supernatural aspects of this. But for me, I think the Nessie mystery is an ideal example of what it means when you talk about like a supernatural lake monster. I think there's something way, way more beyond than just unknown animals. I think we're dealing something that arguably it may not even should be in the category of of cryptozoology. Maybe they should actually be in the field of the paranormal and the supernatural and possibly even the occult. I think a lot of these reports should actually be in those categories, not actually in cryptozoology.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I've kind of blended cryptozoology and the paranormal and other aspects of, the supernatural together now for years, because it just seems too crazy not to think that there's some type of connection. I mean, of course, there are going to be people that push back on this. And I think people are a little bit more open-minded than they used to be. But still, there are a lot of people out there that believe that this flesh and blood theory is absolute, and there's no way it can be a paranormal entity.
Well, yeah, and I think a perfect example similar to this would be with the Mothman in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Now, things began with this flying humanoid-type creature, but then in no time, you had the Men in Black on the scene, UFO encounters, the creepy character named Indrid Cold. And so kind of like the situation that's mirrored at Loch Ness, what we saw at Point Pleasant was this sort of blending together of UFOs, of Men in Black, and of Mothman. So you've got the UFO angle, the weird paranormal angle, and the strange creature angle. And I don't really understand why so many people in the field sort of steer away from this side, whether it's they're sort of worried about, what their peers and their comrades and colleagues think about it. For me, I don't really care. I just tell it as it is. And if people like what I like, that's great. If they don't, well, that's how it goes. I ain't going to lose no sleep over the fact that somebody doesn't like the fact that I think the Nessies are supernatural. I think they are. I can only tell it as I see it. But I think belief plays into this a lot. People are sort of born into this sort of their plesiosaurs, or Bigfoot is a Gigantopithecus ancient ape. I think there's far more to this, but when a lot of people get into this weirder side, they don't like it and it freaks them out. They kind of, they move away from it.
Well, I'm right in the same boat with you, brother. I've been hearing all of that ever since I've been doing this. So I can definitely understand that. Now, when you talk about lake monsters or lake creatures, they all seem to be, and I'm talking like Champ, Pepe, Ogopogo, the whole 9 yards. They all seem to be a serpentine-like a being. Now, of course, there have been some photographs taken. I think the most interesting video taken was the ABC video at Lake Champlain. That, of course, this long, dark, serpentine creature, I mean, that, almost looked like a huge eel of some type. But, and you talked about the eels, that maybe these are some type of, I don't know, some type of overgrown eel or another species that we just don't know about.
Well, actually, that's a good point, because one of the big problems, if you like, which gets things really confused, is the fact that I don't think we can place all of these things into a category of the paranormal or the occult. But by the same token, I don't think we can place them, as totally just flesh and blood. And the problem is so many people in cryptozoology, they want it to be this or they want it to be that. They want it to be nailed down as this particular scenario. And unfortunately, so many of these cryptid cases, you cannot apply that kind of strict scenario to those cases. And so I think, we could actually be looking at things like in the lakes, for example, giant eels, things like that. But others seem to be, like I said with Crowley, more of an occult type entity.
Mm-hmm.
And in just the same way, you look at some of these stories that even come out, with Champ in Lake Champlain. I mean, although most of the reports people have described seeing this sort of long creature, there are a few supernatural aspects. And like, for example, how the Native American people of the earlier eras, they didn't believe those creatures were just unknown animals, that they were something supernatural to be sort of both feared and revered.
Yeah, that kind of gets lost in the whole genre of this, that, early on, the native peoples didn't really describe these as natural beings, but supernatural or spirits. Yeah.
Well, yes, spirit walkers, I mean, you can find them everywhere. For example, interestingly enough, in Scotland, particularly in the northern parts of Scotland, or the further northern parts of Scotland, you had stories going back about 300 years of what were known as Kelpies.
Right.
And Kelpies were basically shapeshifters, and they would manifest in the form of like a beautiful woman, and she would stand, or it, but it would literally be an it, but it would present itself as a she. And she would stand near the edges of the loch, the ancient lochs, and they would have this sort of ability to hypnotize men and bring them towards the water. And the story was that they would sort of drag men into the depths of the Scottish lochs and steal their souls. And as I said, they were known as Kelpies. And the word Kelpie is an ancient Scottish word for water horse. And the reason being that supposedly they could take on the form of not just a beautiful woman, but also like a black horse, which would drag people into the water. So again, you've got this crossover of supernatural creatures versus something that looks like a horse until, the very last second, you're sort of hauled down 500 feet into the depths, and waiting for whatever comes after death, So,
yeah.
But I think one of the big problems, as I see it, is that cryptozoology as a field isn't wide and opening enough and open-minded enough to take on, the supernatural side of it. I mean, I get that so often, with things like the dogmen, the dogman phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way in my mind that those are just, just an upright wolf type creature. I think there's something far beyond that. And a lot of the, sort of the lesser known flying humanoids, everybody's heard of Mothman, but there's a lot of other ones, there's Bat Squatch and the Owlman and all these different ones. But there always seems to be a weird aspect to them. But, a lot of people in cryptozoology, I mean, trying to convince them, it's like, I don't know what it's like, but it's a hell of a pain in the neck,
Well, I mean, when your witnesses start saying that they see glowing eyes on one of these things, the first thing you got to say is, well, that's not natural. I mean, there's something else with this, and the one, many of the reports we have been receiving are these entities do have wings, but they have some type of propulsion that doesn't even use the wings. So, I mean, yeah, you're right. There's a lot of different aspects of a lot of these cryptids that, are just not natural.
Yeah, and I think one of the most important things is that, a lot of people in cryptozoology say, well, this can't be true, or this doesn't tie in with what I think. But the fact is, the words, and the data that we're getting are coming from the witnesses. And I always tell people, whether it's ufology or ghost hunting, which I don't know much about, but, whether it's UFOs, ghost hunting, Bigfoot, UFOs, the fact is the most important people are the witnesses. And, for people to say, well, this just cannot be true, when they weren't actually there, but the witnesses were there and they knew exactly what they saw, that's an important thing. We should not ignore or skew the evidence that's given us from the witnesses. We should actually, go directly with the evidence and the data from the witnesses and go on their words, because they were there. We were not there,
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I always give a witness the benefit of the doubt until I prove otherwise. And most of the time, when you talk to them, they saw something. Or let's put it this way, they think they saw something. And that's what they're expressing to you. And when they finally do come to you, you're part of that then. And, that's where the evidence lies. And, of course, you're going to get arguments from people that just, are skeptical of it, but that's just the way it is. You were talking about the Kelpies. That can almost be compared to the mermaid reports that used to come out of the Caribbean by the early sailors. And, these beings that were like sirens, I would suppose, where they'd grab a sailor off a boat and take him to the depths and kill him. I mean, what was going on back then. I mean, I know some people try to say that they were actually seeing manatees and, characterizing them as these mermaids, though that's hard for me to believe unless they're shape-shifting.
Yeah, and again, you can see sort of strange things in the oceans, which eventually, were proved to still exist. Like, for example, the coelacanth, this old fish, going back millions of years, which everybody thought had become extinct. But it was found, in the 1930s off the coast of South Africa. But then on the other side, you've got, as you said, like the sirens and mermaids and mermen and that kind of thing. So I think so many people want it to fit into one category, but the fact is, these things just don't fit into one category. And if you try and do that, it just causes more and more problems.
Yeah, you're right. I had one of my readers sent me a question when they found out that you were going to be on this week, and they asked me to ask you. So here it is: are alligators in the New York sewer system a myth?
No, that's really true. Now, there actually is a genuine report which you can find in the New York Times in the 1930s, and a small alligator was actually found in the depths of the New York sewer system. But most of the other stories are pretty much like friend of a friend type stories. However, when you've got one absolutely 100% genuine story, then that sort of begs the question, well, what if some of those other, there was another one there or a few more and they mated, and that there could be more. I mean, I think we would know if there was sort of, sort of 20 or 30 15-foot long, crocodiles or alligators roaming around, eating on all the guys who sort of clean out the sewers. We would know,
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say that it's a really cool scenario, these sort of man-eating alligators under New York. I mean, it's a great story. But what I can say for absolute sure is that one was actually found in the sewers of New York, and it did create briefly a lot of amazement, but that's a big difference from them sort of, as I said, sort of mating and then, something, a scenario like on one of these cheap sci-fi channel movies, with these actors who are way past their time,
I used to enjoy the story where people would say a New Yorker would go down to Florida for vacation, they'd buy a baby alligator, bring it home, put it in the bathtub till it got too big, and then they take it down the sewer. Well, first of all, I'd like to know how they figured out to get it out of the bathtub and down into the sewer. So,
well, it's interesting you say that, because I can actually see some people doing that. It's almost like, you create the folklore yourself. People know about these stories, and it's kind of a situation. Well, why don't we sort of kick the folklore level to an even bigger level? Let's get a few alligators and drop them in the in the sewers. But it's that again. That's sort of one of these situations where folklore and truth kind of blend two things together. But the story itself was actually this one legitimate story goes back to February 1935, and as I said, it was published in the New York Times, and the story was titled "Alligator Found in Uptown Sewer. Youth shoveling snow, see the animal churning in icy water," which is like a really cool title. And the primary person who had the job of looking into this was a guy named Teddy May, and he was the commissioner of sewers in New York. And Teddy May was the guy who pretty much began the investigations and put all the files and the witness testimony together. But as I said, it was not a huge body of data. It was just in the 30s, and it just revolved around what Teddy May collected from people in the area, and the rest of it was pretty much, exaggeration and people kind of, spreading stories. Probably.
There is one fish story that I know is an actual fish that I find fascinating, and I've heard so many rumors about this. Are those Wells catfish in Central and Southern Europe? He's huge, Behemoth Catfish, and people claim that these are man-eaters. What do you believe in that?
Well, I mean, catfish can grow to huge sizes, and there are rumors of people being swallowed live and in one piece, by huge catfish. And there was actually a very controversial story, which actually proved to be real, in the UK, up in the north of England, when from round about 2000 to about 2003, at a place called Moorland Mere, and people were seeing this the water splashing and this sort of hump coming out the water, and some of the wildfowl on the mere itself vanishing. And a zoologist who camped out there and spent a lot of time there, Richard Freeman, a good friend of mine, he used to work as a full-time zoologist in England, and then he moved into the field of cryptozoologist. And Richard actually had a quick view of one of these things and was absolutely sure that it was a large catfish. Now, the idea of seeing a catfish of 9 to 12 feet long in the UK, little old England, it's sort of almost unbelievable. But, nature finds ways very often to survive. And, you release an exotic pet into a lake or a river, etc., etc., Mother Nature survives. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that occasionally, that large catfish have been seen. And primarily, it's probably because, like a lot of exotic animals that are originally kept as pets, they get bigger and bigger, and people can't look after them. They don't want to kill them, obviously. And so they release them into a large body of water. And then maybe 6 weeks later, somebody sees part of their body come out of the water, and it becomes known as the local monster, So again, it doesn't surprise me, that there would be something like, catfish roaming around, which, when you see these people, sort of sticking their hands down the throat of a catfish, you know. I mean, that's not a good idea to do that, really. But, I mean, it becomes part of the folklore, you know, of trying to catch a giant catfish.
Oh, these noodlers, yeah. I find that a bit bizarre anyways. But
yeah, I think I'll just stick my arm all the way down a catfish's mouth. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's like a really good thing to do on a Sunday afternoon. You know?
Well, Nick, I tell you, thanks for coming on the show tonight. We're going to have to get back together, and when the Martian book comes out, I definitely want to read that. And I do want to talk to you about these human mutilation cases in the UK. And again, thanks for coming on. I hope things kind of loosen up a bit so you can start getting out on the lecture circuit and such very soon. And take care.
Hopefully, you know, I mean, it's just one of these situations where, you know, I'd love to get back doing lectures and conferences, but then you got going through flights and, you know, gates and, you know, crammed into airports still, you know, planes. It's like, well, I don't know. We'll see.
I agree with you. So you stay safe, and I'll be talking to you soon.
Yeah, you too, Lon. Look after yourself.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Now, if you have an unexplained encounter or sighting, feel free to contact me through the Phantoms and Monsters blog site. If you're interested in supporting Phantoms and Monsters and Arcane Radio, you can use the PayPal donation buttons on the blog and newsletter. Our YouTube channel, Beyond Explanation, has new content being added daily, including the Arcane Radio archive shows. And once again, this Sunday at 9 o'clock, we will be doing the Ask Lon Anything chat over at the Beyond Explanation YouTube channel. So I want to again thank Nick Redfern for joining me this evening, and I want to thank you for listening to the show. Stay healthy, have a safe and enjoyable weekend. Good night.